Hey everyone, in this video we are going to add the obstacle to the tracks. And as I mentioned in the last video, it's very similar to how we instantiated the tracks themselves. We're just going to have to also add a randomized element because right now there isn't anything randomized about the position of the tracks. It's just incrementing along the z-axis. Whereas for this, since we want an obstacle to be on just one track, we're going to have to choose a random number between -1, 0, and 1. So again, having those nice, clean, even numbers continues to benefit us. So let's start with the bricks. And again, it creates this empty parent for whatever reason. So unpack prefab, drag and drop to get the child away from that, and then delete, right click, rename bricks. And then we'll just do this again so I don't forget. Put the cart in the scene, right click, unpack, drag that away, delete, rename cart. Then we'll move that one to the side for now. We'll deal with it later. And then the crate, we'll put that in the scene. And again, unpack, left click, drag that away, delete, rename, and that will be crate. And again, we'll move that one off to the side, get it out of the way. And then crate tall. Right click, unpack prefab, left click, drag, separate it, and then right click, rename, and we'll do DBL underscore crate. And we'll move that one over. And we'll just deal with these one at a time. So that's just a holding place, doesn't matter where you put those at the moment. So we'll click on the bricks, and we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to shrink this a little bit. There shouldn't be any collision issues since this is no more than one block in size, so there shouldn't be any kind of overlap. But you also don't want to be unforgiving with what you're asking the player to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to shrink this just a tiny bit. If you're happy with the size of whatever obstacle you created, then you don't have to do this step, just explaining why I'm doing it. So all I did is I had the object selected, and I came over to the transform and I scaled it to 0.9. And now we're just going to raise this up a little bit. And while I'm raising this up, I just want to mention that my current intention is to not use gravity. It really isn't necessary. Even though the character is going to be jumping, there's a very easy way to take care of that without using gravity. So the reason why I'm mentioning that is if you see things floating a little bit over the track, it's fine. It's not a problem. So we are going to add a collider to this. So we're going to add component, physics, and we're going to use a mesh collider. So the collider should match the actual meshes of the object. And I think that's all we need for that object right now. So we'll take the bricks, put them into the asset area, and that turns them into a prefab. So we can now delete the bricks from the scene. Because just like the tracks, we're going to be instantiating the bricks from the asset area. Okay, next up, let's go to the crate. We'll raise this up a bit. Now this one's smaller, so I'm not going to be worried about shrinking the size of this object. We can get the hovering over the rails a little bit closer. And again, since the camera is going to be looking down from above, if there's a gap, they're not going to see it. So for the crate, we are going to, suppose we could also use a mesh collider for this as well. It makes it a little bit more complex than necessary because really adjusting for the indentation shouldn't matter. So, yeah, we'll just use a mesh collider. We can always swap over to a box collider if it's creating an issue, but it really shouldn't. So add component, physics, and we will do Mesh Collider. And I believe that should be it for now. And so we'll drop that into the asset area, turning that into a prefab. Now we'll work with the double crates. Raise this one up. And I'm specifically doing this in the order because I want you to realize that once you've added one prefab, it really is just rinse and repeat. You're doing the same thing over and over again. And okay, so we will add a mesh collider for this one. So the double crate, add component, physics, mesh collider. And we'll take that, drag that into the asset area. And the last one is the cart. So this one we have to do a couple of things with. The other ones we did not care about rotation because the crates are symmetrical, but the cart is not. So the cart matters because if this cart was just sitting here idle, then it doesn't matter. But this cart is actually going to move. So we need to do a couple of things. So for one thing, we need to, in addition to raising this up, we need to rotate this. I believe -90 on the y-axis is what we want. Yep. And why does that work? Because again, up and down is y, so you're rotating around that, like rotating around a pole. So now we just lower this a bit. And again, doesn't have to be exact. Okay, so that's been rotated. Let's give it its collider. Now, in this case, we don't want the player to be able to land inside the cart, but I don't think we have to worry with the box collider, that we can just still use a mesh collider because any collision can be detected. So we'll still do physics and we'll do mesh collider. But since it's going to be moving, so what's going to happen is when it gets instantiated, when it gets spawned, it's going to be out here and it's going to be moving toward you. So basically you'll have to time your jump differently than timing the crate. And that's one of the things you want to consider is this kind of incremental and progression to difficulty. So this object and this object, 1 block high, but stationary, this 1 block high, but it's moving. So again, a progression of difficulty. So we will add physics and we will add rigid body, and we're going to disable for gravity because, like I said, for the moment, not going to use gravity. I'm pretty sure we can get around this without any gravity. And now we just take the cart and drag and drop that into the scene. And that sets up all of our objects that we're going to use in this current tutorial. So now let's go to the coding. So as I mentioned, we are going to handle the spawning of these objects very similar, but with one change. Rather than just changing Z, we also need to modify X because we want to decide, do we want it on the left, middle, or right lane, -1, 0, 1. So we're going to create a randomizer and we're going to modify the X-axis accordingly. So to do that, first we need to replicate this. So we're going to do a public transform, and we'll do the bricks first. So we'll just call this bricks obj, and again, trying to keep a consistent naming convention. So when I see this pre-populated, I'll know that it's referring to a game object, or should I say a prefab that I'm trying to instantiate. This one should also be a private vector3, just like the corresponding vector3 above it, and we'll call this next bricks, next brick spawn. And you do want to be careful not to make the names too similar, though. See, next and spawn, you're going to want to make sure you grab the right one. So naming convention is important, but it should be done in such a way that it enables you, not confuses you. So now what we need a random number. So what we can do, we're going to create let's do private. Let's do an int, and the name will be rand x because we're making a random number for x. Okay, so now what we're going to do, we need to spawn something on the z. So this will spawn, since the z is the center point, it will spawn the object on the center point. So we instantiate the tile. Now we're going to instantiate the bricks. And so what's being instantiated, the bricks, where it's being instantiated. Okay, this is where we're going to have to make a change. I'll type this in, but then we're going to make a modification. So we want the next brick spawn is the location, and then we want to use the bricks OBJ's own rotation. So again, the three arguments: what's being rotated, what's being instantiated, what's being instantiated, where it's being instantiated, and the rotation of what's being instantiated. So we save that. So problem is this will spawn it at the center point because right now x is 0. So what we need to do, we need to, every time this loops, we need a random number to be generated. So we will do rand x equals random dot range, and then you have to give the range -1. So that's one endpoint, and then the other endpoint is +1 because you want to use -1, 0, or 1. So again, having three numbers that are sequential, they're integers, so it really works out very good. You don't have to do any kind of adjustment for math. It's just -1, 0, and 1. But here's the thing. This number is inclusive, which means -1 will be selected. This number is not inclusive, so that means even though you're saying -1, 1, it'll only choose -1, 0. So you actually always have to bump that number up by 1. So even though the documentation says that this is inclusive, it's not. We save that. And so now what we do, we need to say that next brick spawn, and again, this is a vector 3, is equal to next tile spawn. So first, we're taking the new value for this, dumping it into here, but then we want to modify the z. Excuse me, the x, my apologies. We want to modify the x because we're choosing which lane it's in. So next brick spawn dot x. So we're pulling out that one vector, the one number out of the 3 because there's an x, there's a y, and a z. We want to pull out the x and make it set to that random number. So that is rand x. And if I haven't made any mistakes, that should do our randomization. So let's do a quick walkthrough. So this is going to reference the object. This is going to reference the object. This is going to reference its position, and this is going to be the random number for the x position. The start section comes down here. We randomize this number between -1 and 2, but since 2 isn't included, that means our results will be -1, 0, or 1. The next brick spawn, so that vector 3 will be set to the next tile spawn number. Then we modify the X, so this updates the Z. Well, it updates X, Y, and Z, but the only one that's changed up to this point is the Z. This updates the X, and then it gets spawned here. And if we don't put anything here, then that means this is spawned, the bricks will be spawned every other track. Let's go with that for the moment, even though that won't be very difficult as far as only having one obstacle every 6 rows. It's still a start. Okay. Now, we might also have to adjust its first spawn point because we don't want the player running and seeing the object spawning on the screen. But it shouldn't, since we're not seeing the tile, the rail spawn on the screen, then we shouldn't see the block spawn on the screen either. So let's see if I didn't mess anything up. Actually, GM object, bricks object, I didn't put it there yet. So put the brick object there. Oh, and the cart, I didn't delete from the scene. There's our bricks. There's our bricks. There's our bricks. And just like that, it's a little bit too high. So actually what we'll do, since the vertical for the brick should always be the same, we can just manually put that in. So what we can do, so next brick spawn dot y, rather than being 0, should be like, I think it was like 0.19. Let's try 0.2. So now we've updated X, Y, and Z, but then we overwrite Y and we overwrite X. So at some point we probably should just change this to the Z. So like .Z, but don't feel like doing it at the moment. Don't want to get distracted. So now what we're doing is we're raising up the spawn of just the bricks. There we go. So that's a little bit too high, but we're just about there. So it probably was like 1918. There you go. Probably could be a little bit lower. Also, our camera isn't quite right. I'm pretty sure the camera is a little bit too high, and the angle might have to change a little bit too, but the camera is definitely a little bit too high. So one last tweak to the code. Let's drop that to 0.16. And then we save that. And then we will, as we said, change the camera a little bit. So we will lower that one. Like I said, I don't want to get too much into the exact positioning of the camera, because that's a key aspect of the game balance. And now that you're closer, it makes it feel faster because you're looking at a much smaller part of the track. So keep that in mind, that inherently you can make it seem to be going faster or slower based on proximity. But we've accomplished what we wanted to in this video. You now have the random spawning of the obstacle, and it's just a matter of adding more obstacles. So what we'll do in the next video, we'll just, as I say, rinse and repeat. It's just going to be adding another obstacle, the single crate, the double crate, and the cart. And then, like I said, the cart will give movement 2. So let's do that in the next video, because in that one we might have to start tweaking this a little bit more. So far we've been able to keep it, but once we start choosing which obstacle we're going to use, because right now we're just randomizing the position of the obstacle, we now then have to randomize which obstacle. So we're going to have to start putting some if statements in here. So I want you to be able to have a chance to digest this. And then, like I said, in the next video, we'll probably start adding some conditional statements, some if statements to determine which object spawns. So not just that this object spawns in this position, which of the objects will spawn on that position. So it's not hard, but we'll probably do just another random range number, and that will determine which object gets spawned. But like I said, let's leave it here for now. That way you've got the basics of the spawning, and then we'll look at the randomization in the next one. We might even add a placeholder character. I really don't want to get into character animations yet, because that's kind of independent of any other kind of functionality. I really want to be able to get the movement into place. So in the next video, I might also add, like I said, a placeholder character, and that will still allow us to be able to move between lanes. There'll be collision detection, so we can work on abilities like jump. And then probably the final thing we'll do is work on character animation. And that's just the way game design is that it's iterative in nature. Everything you're doing for the beginning of the project is basically just proof of concept. Does it work? Prototyping, that kind of thing. And then you start putting in the bells and whistles. So, okay, I hope that you found this useful. I hope it was helpful to you. If you have any questions, any requests, feel free to put into the comment section. And please enjoy the rest of your day.